you for the introduction, and also I want to thank the organizers for having me. I think in many ways my paper engages with the papers of my colleagues, so it was really interesting to hear those before giving my talk. This paper will consider higher education in Tunisia as an important site for the exercise and contestation of capitalist and neoliberal power, as well as for post-uprising, or rather ongoing uprising struggles in Tunisia over political subjectivities and knowledge production. The Tunisian higher education system provides a particularly interesting vantage point from which to examine the intersection of global and local forms of power and resistance, many of which have already been discussed. And given the numerous conjunctures and often contradictory histories that have fed into Tunisia's current conflicted, higher education institutions in Tunisia's current conflicted state. This includes, in addition, again, to many of the factors that have already been discussed, also the colonial legacies in Tunisia, of course, post-colonial development imperatives, the years of Western-backed authoritarian rule, state retraction and defunding, of course, in the Infitah years as well. Linked, and the focus of this talk has been the intervention of various transnational liberal governance actors seeking to restructure the purpose and function of Tunisian higher education to further meet the needs of global capital. This form of intervention, of course, interacts with the dynamics, interacts with and shapes and is shaped by, in turn, the various dynamics that I've just mentioned, and the ontological, epistemological, social material forces at play shaping the political economy of the Tunisian university. So broadly speaking, some of the aims of these governance institutions include, of course, the opening up of the educational market to profit-based educational management through international trade and investment agreements, significantly reducing the share of state resources invested in higher education institutions, enhancing partnerships between industry and higher education in order to better gear teaching towards the needs of industry, expanding the curriculum and teaching capacity to normalize a neoliberal rendering of the purpose and function of global trade. So this paper seeks to understand the architecture and specific tools entailed by the rolling back and rolling out of the neoliberal higher education agenda in the Tunisian context. And the analysis presented is accumulated from 4 years of my time at the University of Tunis, and in particular, and I'd like, if I have time, to talk about this question of positionality, at the Tunis Business School, which is a state-run public institution. It's the first English instruction institution in Tunisia, run on the 4-year American university model. And so, in many ways, has contributed to these processes that I'm talking about. And I'd like to talk about my own responsibility as well in many of these processes. The paper will begin with a review of the history of the relationship between global neoliberal governance actors and Tunisia's education system, which actually dates back to Tunisia's first World Bank loan in 1962, which actually was granted for education reform to support and includes the most recent World Bank loan to the US to Tunisia in 70 million US dollars to support initiatives, quote, focusing on improving employability and adapting the higher education system better to local and global challenges. I also have a section, which I won't get to, on the World Trade Organization Chair Program, which has been established at the University of Tunis, and which aims to support and promote trade-related academic activities by universities and research institutions, and really normalizes a neoliberal pro-market free trade agenda and curriculum. So, as with, of course, other instances of power, the hegemony of neoliberal higher education governance is never complete. Resistance does and will emerge within the interstices of power, in particular places where internal contradictions are revealed. So the paper concludes with a discussion of some of the insurgent or popular education activities that have been happening largely outside of the university around questions of development in the economy and that challenge capitalist, neocolonial, dominant understandings of development. So these also, I've also borrowed the concept of the undercommons to talk about that, so I won't have to go into that too much. But one of them is a forum on food sovereignty. The other is an observatory, kind of anti-think tank, Tunisian Observatory of the Economy. And then the third is the Jamia Shabia Mohammed Ali Al-Hami, the popular university that's been started and named after a famous Tunisian syndicalist, trade unionist, which is actually located in Sidi Hassin, a real working class southern suburb of Tunis, and doing excellent popular education around all kinds of issues, but the economy being one of them. Okay, so of course, many scholarly and activist accounts of the Tunisian uprising view the mass mobilization that occurred between 2010, 2011, though of course preceding by decades, by years if not decades, through the lens of neoliberalism. Of globalized neoliberalism or late capitalism. In particular, the restructuring and retrenchment of authoritarian power entailed by Tunisia's economic liberalization over several decades. Ironically, and of course this has been stated and restated many times now since the uprising, unreconstructed international financial institutions also see neoliberalism as the issue, but not as the issue in terms of being a problem, but the issue in terms of not being deeply entrenched enough. And so they've been busy at work in terms of trying to intervene at a much more profound level in Tunisia in the post-uprising context, in particular with a dominant focus on higher, or a prominent focus, I should say, on higher education institutions. The solution, of course, derives from the paradigmatic neoliberal worldview, which is that the market it should be the organizing principle for all political, social, and economic decisions. IFIs have played an instrumental role in Tunisia's transition, and this has been revealed in particular, and people may have seen a really important article that came out in Jadaliya by the folks at the observatory, the Tunisian Observatory for the Tunisian Economy, that really pointed out the important, a dominant role of the World Bank, really in structuring Tunisia's transition, and in terms of the expertise that it imposes through conditionalities, the reforms that it demands in exchange for much needed budget support, and leaving, of course, underpinning structural issues unaddressed in order to ensure continued dependency. So I won't go into it here, as again, my colleagues already, of course, higher education, especially in critical or Marxist theory, has been highlighted for its role in reproducing class inequalities, class, race, gender-based inequalities, and conditioning young people for exploitation at work, as well as for an acceptance, really, of their future life conditions and expectations. But this is an important component, of course, of this analysis, is to think about and consider the critical work that has been done on the function of higher education. It's not surprising in general, but it's not surprising in particular in the case of Tunisia, in the post-uprising context, that there's been so much attention on the role of higher education institutions and youth in general. And I'm sure many of you have read the piece by Maysoon Sukaria, where she explains this youth turn in the post-uprising period, which has seen young people invoked as a threat and problem to be solved on the one hand, and as the promise and vision, she says, of a better future to be embraced on the other. And this construction, of course, has enabled a nexus of counter-terror and neoliberal intervention in the service of imperial and domestic elite interests. So IFIs have played a really important role in this, intervening at the level of, or operating or attempting to operate, of course, at the level of biopolitics, at the level of populations, to shape social practices in order to produce cognitive and ideational change. Okay, so just a little bit about the history of Tunisia's university system. Of course, Tunisia is the home to the oldest teaching establishments in the region, with Al-Zaytuna Madrasa founded in 737 CE. Its famous alumni include Ibn Khaldun, the trade unionist Tahir Haddad, politician and writer Abdelaziz Talbi, national poet Abul Qasim Ashebi. Following its independence, Zaytuna University was shut down and was under Habib Bourguiba, and also continued under Ben Ali, whose hegemonic and pro-West rule, although often described as hyper-secular or laïque, was maybe better characterized not so much as a system based on the exclusion of religion from public and political spheres, but rather the absence of asecular spaces and exclusion of independent expressions of religion outside of state control. So I think this is important because an important aspect of this paper and of my work is also looking at alternative forms of knowledge production. So not just how neoliberalism has restructured higher education, or attempting to restructure higher education institutions in Tunisia, but also has tried to preclude alternative forms of knowledge production around the economy, the role and nature of the state-society relations, foreign policy, etc. And that history, of course, dates back to the colonial period and what followed. So a key component of higher education intervention today in Tunisia is focused on the LMD program. This was the transition that was made in the late 80s, early 90s, or still ongoing actually, to it's what's called the Licence Master Doctoral program, which essentially was pushed on Tunisia through the Bologna process as a result of Tunisia's EU partnership. It was initially focused on Europe and a way to sort of synchronize diploma programs in Europe, also as a way to bring in privatization, marketization of higher education in Europe. But already problematic in that context, but of course when applied in the Tunisian context, acquired another level of problems. The Tunisian government has also been, and I don't know how much time, I won't have much time to talk about that because I'm running out of time, but firstly, I mean, one of the areas that it was most problematic, perhaps, was in terms of reducing the number of years that Tunisian students would spend in higher education, forcing a reduction in spending by the Tunisian state on higher education. It was a sort of massification, but without a focus on quality, rather focus on quantity. Again, an introduction as a result also of the pressure from the World Bank of all of these new of these neoliberal kind of new public management principles into the university. Changes in executive power, structural innovation, enhanced flexibility, and ideas of quality control, the introduction of private or fee-paying students into the higher university system. So I really am running out of time, so I just want to sort of skip to the end and talk about what some of the radical alternatives are like. And again, many of these have already been covered by my colleagues, but I think one of the questions that keeps coming up, at least in my mind and in the minds of many of the people that I've been working with and discussing these issues with, is the question of, is the university the best site to resist neoliberalism, capitalism, imperialism, or is it, because of its history of imbrication within these very regimes, very a problematic institution, too problematic in a sense, an institution for that. And I think that's why the words of Robin Kelley in his recent article on Black Study, Black Struggle are extremely relevant. And he also brings up Harney and Moten and their idea of the undercommons and the idea of going outside of the university, looking for collective scholarship, radical knowledge production that can be used to disrupt the reproduction of our culture's class, racialized, nationalized, gendered, militarized stratifications. So obviously I don't have time to get into them, but the organizations that I'm looking at actually do that kind of work in terms of their focus on non-hierarchical learning, moving beyond the university in search of alternative forms of knowledge. In particular, for example, the Food Sovereignty Initiative, which looks to farmers as producers of knowledge, going back before and beyond dominance, neoliberal and capitalist models of development. Also, this idea of non-hierarchical forms of knowledge, the popular university, which looks at horizontality. And in general, and just to conclude, these alternative forms of organizing around the economy and understanding of development have expressed radical alternatives to capitalism based on Tunisia's own historical experiences of development outside of experiences of neo-colonial capitalist discourses, ways of structuring the modes of production, distribution, and accumulation. In doing so, I think they challenge not only content, but also the forms of dominant modes of neo-colonial knowledge production. Thank you.